Hello, so chances are if you're watching this video, you've just started your A&P Anatomy and Physiology 1 class, and usually the class starts with histology, and chances are you're pretty confused. So don't worry, this video is made to help you sort out what the heck is going on with histology and give you some help. Now, histology is just a fancy word for the study of tissues. And what are tissues? No, not Kleenex that you blow your nose on. We're not talking about those kinds of tissues. Tissues are just a bunch of cells put together to perform a certain function. And there are 4 types of tissues. Only 4. I know it may seem like a lot more than that with all the information that's being thrown at you at the beginning of your semester, but there are only 4 types of tissues. So we can narrow it down with by the nervous tissue, the muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, and I always remember how to spell that because I go epi, the, leal, and connective tissue. Now the nervous tissue, let's start with that. The nervous tissue, the function that the nervous tissue does is it regulates and controls all the body functions. The muscle tissue is just that, and its entire function is movement. Now, epithelial tissue, it separates everything out. It provides a barrier. So, you can tell the difference between your heart and your lungs. So your stomach doesn't end up in your intestines. It is a membrane. It creates membranes. And it lines your, just all of the stuff in your body. And it also protects a little bit. And we'll get more into all of this in detail. Your connective tissue is the most abundant in your whole body. It makes up the form. It forms the substance. So when we're talking about your nervous tissue, that is your nerves. Your muscular tissue, obviously, is going to be your muscles. Now, your epithelial is sort of like the wallpaper because it lines everything and provides functions doing that. So your epithelial, I like to think of as wallpaper. It's also your skin, kind of, because your skin is epithelial and connective. And then your connective tissues themselves, that is sort of like the jello in a jello mold. So your connective tissue, think of jello in a jello mold. Your epithelial, think of wallpaper. Your muscle tissues, obviously you want to think of muscles, and your nervous tissues, you want to think of nerves. So your nervous tissue, as I said, it regulates and controls all of your body's functions. So it makes up most of your brain and spinal cord. It has two major functions that you can articulate. One, it senses stimuli. So it senses if you put your hand on a hot stove, it senses the fact that that's too hot. And it also sends electrical impulses through the body. So the sending electrical impulses would be an example of since it sensed the stimuli that you put your hand on a hot stove, the sending electrical impulses sends electrical impulses to your hand to tell your hand to move it off the hot stove so you don't burn yourself. So it senses and it sends. Now there are two types of nervous tissue, and that is the neurons. And those are your actual nerves, what we call nerves colloquially, but technically they're called neurons. So I'm going to put nerves here, but you should get used to actually calling them neurons because that's what they really are. And also something called glial cells. And those are just helper cells for the neurons. So the glial cells are kind of like the personal assistants for the neurons. Now, muscle tissue, there are three types of muscle tissue. The skeletal muscle tissue, and the cardiac, and the smooth. So skeletal, the type of muscle tissue that's called skeletal is, it makes up the muscles that are attached to the skeleton. So that type of tissue moves the bones. So you couldn't take your hand off of that hot stove if you didn't have the skeletal muscle tissue, because that makes up the muscles that are attached to your skeleton that will move your bones, that will move your hand out of the way. Now the cardiac type of muscle tissue is only in your heart. And so that's obviously, your heart is a muscle, and so that's what this is, your cardiac muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue now. Smooth muscle tissue is in the walls of your blood vessels, because believe it or not, your blood vessels have a muscular portion to them, because your blood vessels can contract and expand to deliver your blood faster to different places in your body. If you've ever gotten like flushed cheeks after you ran a race or you were jogging and your cheeks all got all flushed, that's because those blood vessels expanded, so a lot more blood can rush into that area closer to the skin. So when your cheeks are flushed, you're literally seeing the blood through your skin because there's so much blood, because your blood vessels have expanded to let in a lot more blood to that area of your body. Now, within these three types of muscle tissues, your skeletal muscle tissues are the only type that is voluntary. because you can make a decision on whether or not you want to put your hand on that hot stove, right? Your hand just doesn't naturally drift over there and set itself on the stove without your permission. The cardiac muscle is involuntary because your heart beats whether you think about it or not. You don't have to sit there and think, okay, beat, okay, beat, okay, beat, to get your heart to beat. Your heart is going to beat whether you're thinking about it or not, whether you're awake or you're asleep. So the cardiac muscle tissue is involuntary. Involuntary. Your smooth muscle tissue is also involuntary because you can't really control when you're jogging, you know, if you're running a race or you're jogging or working out or something, you can't control the fact that your blood rushes to your face and gives you red cheeks. That's completely involuntary on your part. You can't sit there and say, okay, cheeks get red, and your blood rushes to your cheeks. That's out of your control. So involuntary. So involuntary just means out of your conscious control. Now also what you need to know about these muscle tissue types is the skeletal, they are striated if you look at them with a microscope, and that just means they're striped. They have literal stripes on them. You can see them with a microscope. They're in straight lines. So they're formed together. If you look at them, they're like ribbed. And they're straight lines all together. They're very organized. They're a bundle of lines put together, very organized and very straight. They're also multinucleated. And all that means is that there is more than one nucleus in a cell. Now the cardiac muscle, we've gone over that it's involuntary. It's also striated. But instead of straight lines, it's branching. So instead of the straight organized lines like over there, it comes up and it does one of these numbers, and it comes over and this does this, and it goes like that. And they all kind of fit together, but they're all branching off from one another in kind of a disorganized, cluttered fashion. Also, they are uninucleate, or uninucleate. And of course, uni just means one. So there is one nucleus per cell. Now the smooth muscle lines the walls of your blood vessels and your organs. So, you know, your stomach digests. Sometimes after you eat a big meal, you can feel your stomach digest the food. You can feel your stomach kind of churning the food around. That's out of your control. That's involuntary. So your smooth muscles are also involuntary. And there are no stripes because they're just smooth. And they are also uninucleate. Okay, so let's just go back and review real quick. So histology, the study of tissues. And there are 4 types of tissues. There are the nervous tissues, there are the muscular tissues, and then there are the epithelial tissues, and then there are the connective tissues. So nervous tissues, remember we have, it senses stimuli and it sends electrical impulses. So in and out, it senses and sends. So in and out. It takes in sensory information like that's hot, and it sends out impulses like move your hand off the stove. And then there's the muscular, and there's 3 types of tissues. There's the skeletal, the cardiac, and the smooth. Now we're going to talk about the epithelial, or as I like to think of it, epithelial, so I can remember how to spell it. Now, epithelial tissues, what the epithelial tissues do is they cover things, they line things, and by lining I mean like it's the exact same thing as covering it, but it's on the inside. So if I said this lined your lungs, like here would be a lung, and then if I said line, it would be the lining on the inside. And I like to think of this as wallpaper. So the epithelial tissues are like the wallpaper. They line things, but they also cover things and they create a membrane. So epithelial tissues, an epithelial tissue is a barrier. So whether it's covering things or lining things like wallpaper, what it is it's a barrier or a wall that defines the inside and the outside of something. So that way your heart doesn't get into your lungs. You know, there's a wall there, there's a barrier there. Your stomach doesn't go into your intestines because it each has its own lining, or it each has its own covering that defines that is the stomach. So the stomach contents don't spill into your guts. So that's the general function of epithelial tissues. Also, you want to know that they are polar, which means that they have an apical side, which is the outside, which is whatever side is the side you can see. So if you were up here, if you look up here at the lungs again, if I can see this side of the lining, I can't see the other side because it's attached to the inside of the lungs. So the outside, the side that you can see if you were in there looking at it, that's the apical side. And then there's the basal side. Now I think basal and I think basement. So that is like the bottom, or bottom is another one. That's the bottom layer of the epithelial tissues. So there's these two, not layers, but there's these two sides to it, you know, the outside and the inside, the apical and the basal. So that's what they mean by polar. And the basal is the side that's anchored to connective tissue, which we haven't gotten into connective tissue yet. So don't be confused. We'll talk about connective tissue next, but just know that the basement, you know, or the underside of it, is anchored to the connective tissue. So if you think of a carpet, if you've ever seen a, like a throw rug, if you look at the underneath of a throw rug, let me get different colors here. So if you ever think of the underneath of a throw rug, there's like this the underneath side to it is kind of this mesh material where the fibers are all attached to it. And then on the top of the rug, if you look at the rug, how you're supposed to, or at least these are my rugs in my home. I have shag carpets. But so you have the actual rug itself, the part that we're used to calling a rug is on top, but it's all sewn into this basement layer, this bottom layer. And so just like it's connected to this bottom layer that keeps it all together, keeps the fabric all together into one rug. Just like that, the basal layer of the epithelial tissues is anchored to connective tissue, and connective tissue makes up the stuff that is like the substance, and we'll get into that when we get into connective tissue. Now, epithelial tissue, there are two types of epithelial tissue. There is proper, what they call proper epithelium, and glandular. So proper epithelium is what we normally think of when we think of epithelial cells or epithelial tissues. It covers and or lines, there's that word again, lines, by that I mean wallpaper. It lines the body. It protects and creates a barrier so that organizes things, that keeps your stomach as your stomach, so your stomach contents don't just spill out into your guts. It keeps your stomach, and your guts, and your heart, and your lungs. It's just the membrane wall. Now, glandular epithelial tissue, it forms glands, and those glands secrete hormones with the help of epithelial tissues. So it secretes stuff. The glands secrete stuff. Secrete just means gives off a liquid. So the liquid, what are the liquids that glands can give off? Sweat, mucus, enzymes, and, as I said before, hormones. So there are two types of glands. There are endocrine and exocrine glands. Now, this sounds confusing, but it's really not. Exocrine, spelled like this, think exit. So the glands will secrete stuff that goes out. And then there's endocrine. Endo, I always think indoor. Indoor, that goes to a duct inside. So endocrine, that secretes stuff that stays inside of your body, and it goes through a duct to go somewhere else. Now, it's worth mentioning real quick that not only are epithelial tissues polar, and we went over that, that means it has an outside and an inside. which, you know, duh, everything has two sides to it. So there's the one side is faces the outside, and one side faces the inside. The outside is called apical, and the inside is called basal. Also, you want to know about epithelial cells or epithelial tissues is that they are avascular. And avascular, A means anti or not. So that means they're not vascular. Vascular means it just has blood vessels. So epithelial tissues do not have blood vessels. They rely on to get their nutrition supply and oxygen supply and everything from the connective tissue that they're connected to. So they do not have blood vessels. They are also selectively permeable. And what selectively permeable means is just that it's a wall and it has special doors in it. And the doors will only open for certain things. And what I mean by that is that, like for instance, your blood vessels, when they get all the way out to your lungs, they're selectively permeable. The walls of the blood vessels are selectively permeable in that it's not going to let out the blood. The blood's not going to leak out. But what is going to come out of the blood is the carbon dioxide that we need to breathe out. So the carbon dioxide that's in your blood will go through these special doors that are in the walls of the blood vessels into your lungs and out of your breath. And in exchange, when you breathe in, you're going to take in oxygen, and the oxygen is also allowed to pass through your blood vessel walls and get into your blood and turn your blood red. That's oxygen. So there's special doors. It's not going to let the blood leak out, but it's just going to let specifically carbon dioxide out and oxygen in. So it's just like a bouncer at a club. The bouncer is only going to let certain people into the club, and they're going to kick the drunk people out, so it's just selectively permeable. It's just special doors that only open for specific like molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, what you need to remember about epithelial tissue is that it's classified two different ways. So it's classified in two ways. So there is the shape and there is the layering. So how many layers it has. So the shape of epithelial tissues there's three basic shapes. One is called squamous, and squamous just means flat. And then there's cuboidal, and that means shaped like a cube. And then there's columnar, and that just means it's shaped like a column. Like a Greek column or a pillar. Now the layering, a single layer is called simple. So, for example, simple squamous. that means one layer of flat epithelial cells. And then there is stratified, and that just means stacked. So there's many layers. Like a brick wall is. You know, you got a brick here, and then you got more bricks up here, and more bricks up here. You know, so you have layers. So that the layers, many layers, that just is called stratified. And then also there's kind of a subsection, and it's called pseudo-stratified. And pseudo-stratified, the term pseudo means fake. So what's going on here is that it looks like there's many layers, but there's really only one layer. So pseudo-stratified, fake stratified, and stratified means many layers, so fake many layers. So it looks like there's more than one layer, but there's really not. So what is that all about? So what happens in pseudo-stratified is, if I can get your attention up here in this little box right here, pseudo-stratified would have like a really tall columnar cell, and then next to it, it would have like a short columnar cell, and then it would have a tall columnar cell over it like that, and then it would have a really short cell, and then it would have a kind of a tall cell, and the cells, as you can see, are kind of bending over. So it looks like there's more than one layer. When you look at it, it looks like there's more than one layer, but there's really only one layer because every single cell is attached to that basement membrane down here. And that's pseudo-stratified. So it just looks like a shag carpet, if you know what a shag carpet looks like. It's just all these different height layers, but when you bunch it up and they bend over each other like that, then it looks like, just from first glance, it looks like there's more than one layer, but there's really not. It's all one layer. So when you classify these epithelial tissues, you would say the layers first. You would say the layer type first, and then the shape. So you would say something like simple squamous. So see, the simple comes from the layers right here, and then the squamous comes from the shape. So you would say the number of layers first, and then the shape. So you would say a simple squamous tissue. So now connective tissue is the most abundant and the most diverse. So it's really hard to just say what all connective tissue has in common. What it's more like is if you know, at Thanksgiving dinner or something, and your aunt makes a Jell-O mold, and here's the Jell-O mold, and it has, like, you know, little pineapple chunks or whatever, or carrot chunks in there, or strawberries or whatever they put in there. There's all these little chunks. So connective tissue would be the Jell-O of the Jell-O mold. So it makes the matrix where everything else resides in. And just like a Jell-O mold, it's really springy. So it gives youthfulness to the skin. It makes your skin real springy to the touch when you have connective tissue. And as I had said before, your skin is both epithelial tissue and connective tissue put together. So the connective tissue is what gives you youth to your skin, and gives the springiness and the hydration and the plumpness to it. Now there are 4 classes to connective tissue. So there is proper connective tissue, and proper connective tissue is in the skin, in ligaments, in fat, and that's pretty much, it gives the structure. It's proper is, when you say something's proper, it's pretty much the term for when you normally think about connective tissue, this is what you think about. So this would be connective tissue proper. So you think about the structure. So that would be like the Jello mold. When you think about connective tissue and you think about a Jello mold, then you would be thinking about the connective tissue proper. Also, another class is cartilage. And it's kind of like bone, but it's not as hard as bone. And it binds, supports, and protects. What does it bind, support, and protects? It supports and protects the organs. So also you can think of cartilage as cartilage connects, or it doesn't, yeah, I guess you could say it connects like the ribs to the sternum. There's cartilage in between the ribs. There's cartilage in your knees. There's cartilage in a lot of joints. So that would be supporting and protecting. And the binding would be like when it binds the ribs to your sternum. Also, out of the 4 classes, there's also bone, which is your bones. And the 4th class is blood, which is your blood. So blood is a connective tissue, and blood is responsible for transporting things. Now, all cartilage is comprised of non-living material, and the Jello mold that I was talking about, by the way, when we're talking about connective tissue as a Jello mold, that is what is called the extracellular matrix. So extra in this case means outside. So outside of the cells. So in between the cells, did you ever think what is actually between the cells? It's not air. It's this gelatinous goo that all the cells sit in, just like a Jello mold, and that's called the extracellular matrix. Now this extracellular matrix is made of 2 components. And there's ground substance. Ground substance is just kind of like the glue part to it. And that's starch, protein, and water, in case you're interested. The other substance is just called fiber. So fibers, that's just fibers, and they support and provide structure. And they're kind of like melted in or sewn in into the ground substance. And because the ground substance, you need it because what does the ground substance do? It's the glue. So the ground substance is the glue that holds all the fibers together, and between the two of them, they make up the extracellular matrix. Now we're going to talk about this for a second. We're going to talk about fibers. Okay, so fibers of the connective tissue. Because remember, there's two components of connective tissue: ground substance, the glue, and the fibers. So here's the fibers. There are three kinds. There is collagen, elastic, and reticular. Collagen is made out of protein. It's a protein, and it's tough and flexible. It's actually stronger than steel. So if you were to take human human collagen, and make a long string with it, it would be tougher than a steel string. Now, elastic is a type of protein called elastin, and that's what provides it with its stretchiness. So you can stretch it, and obviously because of the name elastic. So elastic is just that, it's elastic, so it's stretchy. And then reticular is short collagen and protein covering. So it's short collagen chains of molecules and protein coating something. So reticular actually can be considered like a subclass of collagen, since it's made up of collagen. But just for simplicity's sake, so we don't get a headache, we're just going to give it its own little category here. So reticular fibers, they cradle and support, and they're like a sponge. So if you have an egg and you drop it on a thick sponge, it's not going to break. So if you toss an egg on a sponge, it'll bounce a little bit and it won't break. So likewise, it's going to cushion the organs with its sponginess. So here's a summary of connective tissue. So you got your proper connective tissue, your cartilage connective tissue, your bones, and your blood. They're all made out of two things: ground substance and fiber. Fiber can either be collagen, elastic, or reticular. And just one more thing you need to know about connective tissue is there are two phases of connective tissue, and by phases I mean stages of growth. And stages of growth, like a kid versus an adult. So the two phases are the immature phases, or the immature phase, immature, and then there's the mature phase. The immature phase, when you're referring to the connective tissue cells, the immature phase, it's going to have the word blast at the end of it, like an osteoblast, which is an immature bone cell. So a blast will be at the end of an immature cell of connective tissue. So I'll put down here example: osteoblast. And osteo means bone, so an immature bone cell. Now mature is going to end with the word site, and that means it's a developed cell. So it's like, you can think of it as like an adult cell. So those are the two phases of growth for connective tissue. So just to recap real quick, the nervous tissue has two types of cells, the neurons and the glial cells. The muscle tissue has three types, the skeletal, the cardiac, and smooth. Epithelial is classified by both its layers and shape. So layers are simple, stratified, or pseudostratified, and their shape is squamous, which is flat, cuboidal, or columnar. And connective tissue is either proper, cartilage, bone, or blood. It is also made of either ground substance, or not either, but both ground substance and fibers. And the fibers are either collagen, elastic, or reticular. Okay, whew. So that is my breakdown, my organization of histology, of the study of tissues. Hopefully the whole purpose of this was so you can see how each of the tissues compare with each other, so you can get some kind of an organization system going when you're studying this, and it will help you get an A for A&P.